The Lagos sun beat mercilessly on the corrugated iron roof of Kofi's workshop, turning the small space into a furnace. Sweat dripped from his dark brow as he hunched over the engine of a battered taxi, his calloused hands wrestling with stubborn bolts. At 25, his lean frame bore the marks of endless labor, motor oil permanently stained under his fingernails, a jagged scar across his left forearm from a childhood accident, and worry lines that aged him beyond his years. The creditors had come again that morning. 3 men in cheap suits with expensive threats, reminding him that the 50,000 naira he owed wasn't going to disappear through prayer alone. His mother's medical bills had drained everything, and now the vultures circled, demanding payment with interest that multiplied like Lagos traffic during rush hour. It was at Balogan Market, while buying the cheapest rice he could find, that fate wore the face of an elderly woman. Mama Aduni appeared like a mirage in the chaos of vendors and buyers, her traditional boo-boo robes flowing elegantly despite the market's dust and heat. Gold bangles caught the afternoon light on her weathered wrists, and her head wrap was tied with the precision of someone who understood dignity even in poverty. She moved slowly, supported by an intricately carved walking stick, her dark eyes surveying the market with what seemed like gentle wisdom. When she stumbled near a yam seller's stall, Kofi instinctively reached out to steady her, his strong hands gentle against her fragile frame. "Thank you, my son," she said, her voice carrying the authority of years. Such kindness is rare in these times. Their conversation flowed like palm wine, smooth at first, then intoxicating. Mama Aduni spoke of loneliness, of wealth without purpose, of needing someone strong and dependable to share her remaining years. She had been widowed twice, she explained, and her children lived abroad, leaving her with vast properties and business interests, but no one to trust. Kofi found himself pouring out his troubles. His mother's illness, the mounting debt, the workshops he dreamed of owning but could never afford. Mama Aduni listened with the patience of someone who had heard many life stories, nodding at appropriate moments, her eyes never leaving his face. "Marriage is not always about love," she said finally, her fingers adjusting her gold earrings. "Sometimes it is about survival, about helping each other through this difficult world." The proposal came wrapped in practical terms. She needed a husband for companionship and protection. He needed financial stability. She would pay his debts, set him up with a proper workshop, and in return, he would provide the security and respect that an elderly woman required. It was a transaction dressed in traditional ceremony, but both parties understood the terms. The wedding took place 3 days later in a small ceremony at the local registry. Mama Aduni wore cream-colored lace with gold threading, looking every inch the distinguished matriarch. Her few guests were elderly women from her church, nodding approvingly at the union. Kofi wore the only suit he owned, borrowed from his friend Tunde, who watched the proceedings with barely concealed skepticism. "Something about this doesn't feel right," Tunde had whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. His muscular frame filled out his shirt uncomfortably, tribal scarification on his cheeks catching the light as he frowned. "Why would a woman with her money choose you? No offense, brother, but rich widows have options." But Kofi was beyond caring about suspicions. As he slipped the simple ring onto Mama Aduni's weathered finger, all he could think about was the weight lifting from his shoulders. His debts would be paid, his mother would receive proper medical care, and he would finally have the chance to build something meaningful with his life. That first night in her spacious house in Victoria Island, surrounded by furniture that cost more than he earned in a year, Kofi allowed himself to believe that sometimes desperation could lead to deliverance. He had no idea that deliverance was just another word for trap. The Victoria Island mansion felt like a museum after dark, its high ceilings and marble floors echoing every footstep. Kofi had spent 2 restless nights in the guest bedroom. Mama Aduni had insisted on separate sleeping arrangements until they were more comfortable with each other, staring at ornate ceiling fans that cost more than his monthly rent used to be. On the 3rd night, nature called at 2 a.m. Padding barefoot through the corridor, Kofi noticed something odd. Mama Aduni's bedroom door stood ajar and the bed was empty, covers thrown back hastily. The walking stick she claimed to need for mobility leaned unused, against the mahogany nightstand. Concern drove him through the house, checking each room with growing anxiety. The kitchen was empty, the living room undisturbed, the study locked. It was only when he peered through the front window that he saw the empty space where her Mercedes had been parked. Sleep became impossible. Kofi paced the marble floors like a caged animal, scenarios spinning through his mind. Had she fallen ill? Been robbed? At 70, what business could possibly require her attention at this ungodly hour? At 4 a.m., he heard the purr of the Mercedes pulling into the driveway. From his bedroom window, Kofi watched in amazement as Mama Aduni stepped out of the driver's seat with fluid grace, her movements sharp and purposeful. Gone was the careful shuffle he'd grown accustomed to. She moved like a woman half her age, her back straight, her steps confident, but it was her clothing that made his breath catch. Instead of her usual conservative boo-boo, she wore a fitted black dress that hugged curves he hadn't known existed, paired with heels that clicked authoritatively on the concrete. Heavy gold jewelry adorned her neck and wrists, not the simple pieces she wore during the day, but elaborate chains that screamed of serious money. She disappeared into the house through a side entrance he didn't even know existed. The next evening, Kofi feigned sleep, listening intently. Sure enough, at 1:30 a.m. he heard the soft sound of her bedroom door opening. This time he was ready. Slipping on dark clothes, he crept to the window and watched her emerge again, transformed into the same mysterious figure from the night before. This time. He followed. The Mercedes led him through Lagos's sleeping streets, past closed shops and flickering streetlights, into areas of the city he'd never seen. They drove through Ikoyi, past towering luxury apartments, then deeper into the mainland where the buildings grew lower and the streets narrower. The car finally stopped outside what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse in Mushin. But appearances, Kofi was learning, could be devastatingly deceptive. As he watched from the shadows, the seemingly derelict building came alive with activity. Men in expensive suits emerged from luxury cars. Women in designer dresses clicked across the pavement in imported heels, and the bass line of high-life music pulsed from within the building's walls. Mama Aduni walked through the entrance like she owned it, because as Kofi would soon discover, she did. Creeping closer, he found a crack in the warehouse's corrugated walls that offered a view inside. What he saw defied every assumption he'd made about his elderly wife. The space had been converted into Lagos's most sophisticated underground casino. Poker tables dominated the center, surrounded by slot machines that flashed neon colors into the smoky air. A full bar ran along one wall, staffed by bartenders who moved with professional precision. And at the heart of it all sat Mama Aduni, no longer the frail widow, but a queen pin holding court. Men who looked like they could buy and sell small countries sought her attention. She counted stacks of cash with the efficiency of a bank teller, spoke in rapid Yoruba that carried the authority of absolute command, and moved through her domain with the confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. The walking stick was nowhere to be seen. The hunched posture had vanished. Even her voice, when she laughed at something one of her associates said, carried a different timbre. Younger, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. Kofi crouched in the shadows for 2 hours, watching his wife orchestrate what was clearly one of Lagos's most lucrative illegal operations. Money changed hands in amounts that made his head spin. He saw politicians he recognized from television, business leaders whose faces graced newspaper financial sections, and enough luxury cars to stock a showroom. As dawn approached and the crowd began to thin, Kofi crept back to his motorcycle and raced home, his mind reeling with implications. He managed to slip back into bed just as he heard the Mercedes pulling into the driveway. 20 minutes later, Mama Aduni shuffled past his door, walking stick tapping against the marble, moving with the careful deliberation of a woman whose bones ached with age. Lying in the darkness, Kofi realized that his marriage wasn't just built on lies. It was constructed from them, like a house built on sand. But the real question wasn't what his wife was hiding. The real question was why she had chosen him to hide it from. The confrontation came at breakfast, 3 days after Kofi's midnight revelation. He sat across from Mama Aduni at the mahogany dining table, watching her delicately sip her tea while his stomach churned with unasked questions. She wore her usual morning attire, a simple wrapper and modest blouse, her gray hair covered with a plain head tie, the picture of elderly respectability. "You were out late last night," Kofi said carefully, testing the waters. Mama Aduni's spoon paused midway to her mouth. For just a moment, her eyes sharpened with the same intelligence he'd witnessed at the warehouse. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I couldn't sleep, my dear. Sometimes I drive around to clear my head, old habits from when I was younger." Her voice carried the tremor of age, but Kofi now heard the calculation beneath it. Before he could respond, the front door exploded inward with a crash that rattled the expensive china. Tundi burst through like an avenging spirit, his muscular frame filling the doorway, tribal scarification stark against his dark skin. His eyes blazed with fury and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "You," he roared, pointing a thick finger at Mama Aduni. "I should have known." Mama Aduni's transformation was instantaneous. The frail elderly woman vanished like smoke, replaced by someone who rose from her chair with fluid grace, her back straight, her eyes cold as Lagos rain. The walking stick leaned forgotten against her chair. "Tundi," she said, and her voice now carried the authority Kofi had heard at the warehouse. "You've grown up? Don't you dare act like you know me." Tunde's voice cracked with emotion. "After what you did to my family, after you destroyed everything." Kofi looked between them, confusion mounting. "You two know each other?" Tunde's laugh was bitter as spoiled palm wine. "Know each other? Kofi, meet your wife, also known as my grandmother, the woman who stole our family land, disappeared with everything we owned, and left us to rot in poverty." The revelation hit Kofi like a danfo. "Us?" He stared at Mama Aduni, seeing her features clearly for the first time. The strong jawline, the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes narrowed when challenged, all reflected in Tunde's face. "That's impossible," Kofi whispered. "You said your grandmother was dead." "I thought she was. She's been gone for 15 years. Tunde advanced into the room, his movements predatory. "But I've been hearing stories in the streets, seeing faces that looked familiar, started asking questions, following leads. Imagine my surprise when I discover Lagos's biggest underground gambling operation is run by the woman who destroyed my childhood." Mama Aduni, or whoever she really was, smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since Kofi had known her. "It was terrifying. You always were the smart one, Tunde, just like your grandfather." She moved to pour herself more tea, as if discussing the weather. "Though I see you inherited his tendency toward dramatics as well." "Dramatics?" Tunde's voice rose to a shout. "You stole our inheritance. Our father's land, our mother's jewelry, everything. We had to move to the slums because of you." "I invested wisely," she replied calmly. "That worthless plot of land became 3 luxury hotels. Your mother's jewelry became seed money for a business empire. Would you rather I had left everything to rot while your father drank himself to death?" Before Tunde could respond, the front door opened again. 3 men entered with the confidence of people who belonged wherever they chose to be. Kofi recognized them immediately. Faces from the warehouse, associates who had shown Mama Aduni obvious deference. But now he saw the family resemblance. The tall one had her eyes, the stocky one her stubborn chin, and the youngest shared her predatory smile. All 3 were dressed in expensive clothes that marked them as serious players in Lagos's underground economy. "Mother?" the eldest said, his gold teeth catching the morning light. "We heard there was trouble." "Your sons," Kofi said numbly. "The ones who live abroad." "Live abroad?" The middle son laughed, displaying neck tattoos that suggested his career hadn't involved overseas graduate school. "We live in Banana Island, brother. Never left Lagos in our lives. Though we appreciate the fictional distance," added the youngest, adjusting his designer watch. "It made inheriting your half of Mother's empire much simpler." The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Kofi looked around the room, at his childhood friend trembling with rage, at the woman who had married him under completely false pretenses, at 3 dead sons who were very much alive and clearly unhappy about having to share their criminal inheritance with a stranger. "This was all planned," he said, his voice hollow. "The meeting at the market, the marriage proposal, everything." Mama Aduni's smile was almost proud. "You were perfect, Kofi. Young enough to seem legitimate, desperate enough to ask no questions, honest enough to trust completely. And now you're legally entitled to half of everything I own. Which is why," the eldest son said, cracking his knuckles, "we're going to have to kill you." The expensive dining room erupted into chaos. Tunde grabbed a chair. The 3 sons advanced, with menacing intent, and Mama Aduni stood in the center like a general surveying her troops. Kofi realized that marrying for money had been the cheapest mistake he'd ever made. The dining room became a battlefield. Tunde swung his chair like a club, catching the middle son across the shoulder with a crack that sent the man stumbling backward into the china cabinet. Expensive plates crashed to the marble floor as the eldest son lunged for Kofi, gold teeth bared in a snarl. Kofi's years of manual labor served him well. He ducked under grasping hands and rolled behind the dining table, his lean frame allowing him to move quickly through the chaos. The youngest son vaulted over the table with surprising agility, designer clothes and criminal intent making for an incongruous combination. But it was Mama Aduni who brought order to the madness. "Enough!" Her voice cut through the violence like a machete through sugarcane. Every man in the room froze, even Tunde pausing mid-swing. She stood in the center of the destruction, no longer pretending frailty, her presence commanding absolute attention. "This is not how we handle family business," she said, straightening her blouse with dignity. "Violence is the last resort of simple minds, and I did not raise simple children." The eldest son rubbed his jaw where Tunde's chair had caught him. "But mother, he knows everything now. And the boy," he jerked his head toward Kofi, "he's legally entitled to exactly what I planned for him to be entitled to," Mama Aduni interrupted smoothly. "Did you think I married him by accident? Did you believe I chose randomly?" She walked to an ornate cabinet and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "Kofi, my dear husband, let me show you what you've inherited." With growing dread, Kofi approached as she spread papers across the destroyed dining table. Legal documents, business registrations, property deeds, all bearing his name alongside hers. "The warehouse where you followed me, registered in your name. The 3 luxury hotels built on my grandson's family land. Your name is on those deeds too. The gambling operation that generates millions in untraceable income. Congratulations, you're the legal owner." Kofi's hands shook as he read document after document. "But I never signed these. Signatures are surprisingly easy to forge when you have the right connections," the youngest son said with professional pride. "We've been preparing for months." The trap revealed itself in all its elaborate horror. Mama Aduni had married him, not for companionship or even for practical convenience, but to make him the legal face of her criminal empire. Every illegal transaction, every tax evasion, every crime that couldn't be traced to a 70-year-old grandmother could now be pinned on her desperate young husband. "The police raids start tomorrow," she continued conversationally. "Anonymous tips about a young mechanic who suddenly acquired massive wealth through illegal gambling. Your workshop, your mother's house, your bank accounts, they'll all be searched. The evidence will be overwhelming." Tunde stared at his grandmother with a mixture of horror and unwilling admiration. "You're going to frame him for everything." "Frame suggests innocence," Mama Aduni replied. "Kofi legally owns these businesses. When the authorities discover his involvement in money laundering, tax evasion, and illegal gambling operations, they'll simply be uncovering the truth." As if summoned by her words, the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through Victoria Island's quiet streets. Mama Aduni checked her watch with satisfaction, right on schedule. The sirens grew louder, multiplying as more vehicles joined the convoy. Kofi could see flashing lights reflecting off neighboring buildings through the tall windows. "Why?" he whispered. "Why go through all this trouble?" Mama Aduni's expression softened for just a moment, revealing something almost maternal. Because I'm 70 years old, my dear boy. I've built an empire that needs to survive me, and empires require sacrifices. You were willing to marry for money. Now you'll go to prison for it. The front door exploded inward for the second time that morning, but this time it was armed police officers who flooded through. They moved with practiced efficiency, shouting, commands, weapons drawn, spreading throughout the house with tactical precision. "Kofi Ademola!" The lead officer's voice boomed through the mansion. "You're under arrest for money laundering, tax evasion, and operating illegal gambling enterprises." As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Kofi watched the scene unfold with surreal clarity. Mama Aduni had resumed her frail elderly woman persona, leaning heavily on her walking stick as she spoke to the officers in a trembling voice about her shock and betrayal at discovering her young husband's criminal activities. "I trusted him completely, officer," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He said he was a simple mechanic. How could I have known?" The three sons had melted away during the chaos, disappearing through exits they clearly knew well. Only Tunde remained, held back by officers but still shouting over the noise. "She planned everything. She's the real criminal. She's my grandmother and she—" "Sir, you need to calm down or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business," an officer warned. As they led Kofi toward the door, he caught Mama Aduni's eye one final time. She was counting a stack of cash she'd pulled from somewhere, and for just a moment her mask slipped. The smile she gave him was genuinely affectionate, almost proud. "Thank you for your service, husband," she said quietly. "You played your part perfectly." The last thing Kofi saw as they pushed him into the police van was his wife, his business partner, his destroyer, standing in the doorway of her mansion, looking every inch the innocent victim. The walking stick was nowhere to be seen, and her posture was straight as a young tree. In the end, he realized poverty hadn't been his prison at all. It had been his qualification for a much worse cage.